The Lost Forest by Phyllis Root and illustrated by Betsy Bowen. The Lost Forest, published by University of Minnesota Press. How do you lose a forest? First, you need a forest to lose. A forest like the red pines and white pines that once towered in Minnesota, trees that had never been logged. Trees so tall that you had to crane your neck back, and even then you couldn't see their tops. Trees so big 2 people could hardly wrap their arms around a single trunk. You might think a forest would be hard to lose, but in Minnesota in 1882, a survey crew lost a forest. Among those tall trees, black bears scratched for grubs, moose drank at creeks, eagles nested, red-backed salamanders laid eggs in old logs, and tiny coral root orchids grew. But the forest was lost, and it stayed lost, while those tall trees kept growing taller. The United States was growing too. In 1785, the Continental Congress passed a law to survey all the land in the new nation. Native people had lived and hunted, harvested and fished on the land for thousands of years. The land took care of them, and they took care of the land. But the government of the United States wanted their land, wanted that land to own and sell. By the time the survey reached northern Minnesota, most of the land had been taken from Native people, and survey crews were sent to divide up that land. Forests and prairies, swamps, lakes and ponds, rivers and springs, caves and quarries, veins of ore and coal, everything had to be measured and mapped before it could be sold. The surveyors used compasses to find their way. They measured distances with poles and tally pins and chains that were 60 feet long. They carried axes to cut compass bearings on trees. They took notebooks to write the measurements they made. They mapped out townships 6 miles wide and 6 miles long, with borders running north to south and east to west, a grid of land. They divided the townships into sections. And at every corner of every township and every section and every quarter section, the survey crew cut marks on trees or planted posts with bearing marks to locate each piece of land. Year by year, surveyors measured their way across territory that became the states Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota. In the fall of 1882, Josiah R. King and his 3-man crew were hired to survey 3 townships in the state of Minnesota. The crew brought all the things they needed to live on the land for months at a time. A canvas tent to sleep in, blankets to sleep under, flour and pork and beans, dried apples and rice and coffee, matches and frying pans and pails, a piece of cloth to use when mixing bread dough, extra nails for mending boots. The surveyors wore wool hats, coats with waterproof pockets, roomy pants of sturdy fabric, flannel underclothes and wide-soled boots, and a large silk handkerchief to keep mosquitoes, gnats, and moose flies off their ears and necks. If you've ever walked through the woods, you know that the land doesn't care about straight lines. Ridges rise up, streams meander, swamps sink underfoot. If you were trying to turn this rollicking land into straight lines on paper, you might make a mistake. Josiah King did. On a blustery cold November day, he and his crew marked the corner of Township 150, Range 27, Section 34, and drew the map for Coddington Lake about a half a mile farther north than the lake actually was. Maybe they were in a hurry to get home before winter. Maybe they were confused by the swampy land. Whatever happened, Josiah King wrote in his surveyor's notes, "Water very clear and deep, abounding in fish. There is no pine timber in the township." Anyone who wanted to buy land, lumber barons, land companies, settlers, looked at the maps that were drawn from the surveyor crew notes and saw a lake instead of a forest. All around those forgotten tall trees, and all across most of Minnesota, lumberjacks cut down the forest with cross-cut saws and axes, dragged the tree trunks to rivers, floated them downstream to be sawed into lumber, and made into houses and railroad ties and ox carts to carry settlers to Winnipeg. All around Township 150, Range 27, Section 34, the forest disappeared. Trees and orchids, animals that lived among the trees, birds who had nested in them, gone. But no lumber company wanted to buy land that the map showed as a lake. There was no profit in lake water, so that forest stayed lost, and those tall trees kept growing. For 76 years, those lost trees belonged to nobody but themselves, just as they always had. Skunks dug burrows, ovenbirds called, "Teacher, teacher, teacher!" Woodpeckers hammered dead trees for insects. Ruffled grouse drummed. Foxes had pups who grew up to have pups, who grew up to have pups. Moccasin flowers and bunchberries blossomed in the spring. Wind blew snow off pine boughs in the winter. Fire claimed some of the trees. Wind felled others. But most of those tall pines just grew taller and taller. Then in 1958, someone, probably a forest ranger, noticed those tall trees, and a crew came to measure and mark the land. The surveyors discovered that Township 150, Range 27, Section 34, wasn't a lake at all, but a piece of land 1 mile square covered with trees that had never been cut, growing on land that had never been sold. Almost nowhere else in Minnesota had trees like the trees on that lost forest, where the wind blew through the same branches it had blown through 300 years before. All the land around those tall trees was national forest now. Those tall trees were protected forever. That forgotten part of the forest was 114 acres, but because land was often sold in 40-acre parcels, and because the forest had been lost and found again, people called it the Lost 40. The trees had never really been lost. Neither had the orchids, the moose, the warblers, the weasels, the porcupines, the flycatchers, or the flickers. They had always belonged to themselves. But because Josiah King and his 3-man survey crew made a mistake, because they misplaced a lake on a map for 76 years, you can go today and walk under trees so tall you have to crane your neck to see their tops. You can try to wrap your arms around a white pine tree that is 350 years old. You can walk through time and see the woods as it used to be, and still is, in the lost and found forest. This is where the Lost 40 is located in Minnesota. Here is a photograph of Josiah King's surveying crew and their journals and maps from their notebooks. This is a photograph of the best pine in northern Minnesota, Black Duck area in the early 1900s.